Right, so I think we are going to start. So welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. My name is Dominique Martin. So I'm a professor of ethics at the School of Management Science at the Université du Québec à Montréal. And well, I don't know if it's too late already, too late in the month, but at first I want to wish you a happy new year. A nice and happy new year. Hopefully it will be better this year than last year. That was objectively pretty bad. And I wish you're all having a nice beginning of year. So I would also like to welcome, well, first Carissa Véliz, and then our two discussants for the talk today, so Sébastien Gambs and Mario Quentin. I will introduce them in a few minutes. I also want to thank everyone for your continued interest and participation in this speaker series in the ethics of AI. So today we have a conference by Carissa, and we have another conference that is scheduled next month by Li and Nguyen Ong on February 18. All the information is on our website. The title of the conference is Recommendation Algorithm as a Fantastic Opportunity for Good. And we are also planning to have two additional conferences this year, and the information will be available on our website as soon as everything is worked out. I also want to say before we start, so the video recording of our last conference from Martin Gibert is available on our website as well, so you can have a look if you want. I will send the link on the chat if you want the link to the website. And as you may have noticed, we will be recording the conference today. So we encourage people to keep their video feed open because we're trying to make this event as human-friendly as possible in spite of the circumstances that force us to host the event online. It's always nicer for the speaker, I think, for the discussion and everyone to see actual human faces and not simply white names on black screen when they are speaking. But of course, you are welcome to do whatever you prefer in terms of keeping your video open or not. But I just want to specify that the event today is being recorded and should be made available on YouTube, as it was the case with our previous events. So the plan for today, as always, is to have, well, the main talk by Carissa Véliz for 45 minutes. And then we'll have, so our two discussants will make comments and raise discussion point. So Sébastien Gambs and Mario Quentin. And then I will offer an opportunity to Carissa to perhaps reply to these comments. And then we'll open the discussion to questions from the public. I will re-explain that later, but if you want to ask a question during question time, well, first, if your video was turned off, I encourage you to turn it on so we can see you if you're okay with that. But also, if you want to ask the question yourself, simply write your name in the chat, and then I will offer you an opportunity to ask the question. If you write a question in the chat, then I will ask the question for you. Questions can be asked in English or in French. If they are in French, I will translate them for Carissa. Don't worry, Carissa. And if need be, I can translate in the other direction. C'est aussi le bon moment pour, premièrement, vous souhaiter la bienvenue en français. Je ne vais pas répéter toutes les informations là, que j'ai dites en anglais, mais je veux simplement spécifier donc la conférence d'aujourd'hui d'abord va être en anglais, mais pendant la période de questions, si vous préférez poser vos questions en français, vous êtes bienvenus de le faire et à ce moment-là, je traduirai vers l'anglais pour Carissa et je retraduirai en français si besoin est. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to welcome Carissa, who is an associate professor at the Faculty of Philosophy and the Institute for Ethics in Artificial Intelligence at Oxford University, as well as a fellow at the Hertford College, also at Oxford University. I think she is also a consultant on questions of privacy and various issues regarding information technologies. So our main work is in the area precisely of privacy, technology, and the moral and political philosophy and public policy. She is the author of a book, Privacy is Power, which is the main reason why we invited her to this series and which will be the main focus of her talk. But she's also the editor of a forthcoming book entitled Oxford Handbook of Digital Ethics. And if you check her website, there's also plenty of other information, including her other research paper, podcasts, episode, and other publication. So Carissa, I think you're welcome to start whenever you want. Yeah, so about 30-45 minutes. I will start making you signs at 30 minutes just to make sure we keep we don't take too much time. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Nick. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for being here, particularly in these very, very weird times. I really appreciate your time and attention. I started getting interested in privacy issues about 6 or 7 years ago. It started as a very personal pursuit. I was researching the history of my family. My family were Spanish refugees from the Civil War who ended up in Mexico. And I went into the archives looking for information about them, and I found a whole lot that they had never told us about. And that made me question whether I had a right to know those things that they hadn't told me about, whether I had a right to tell the rest of my family and maybe to even publish about it. And being a philosopher, I turned to philosophy for some answers and didn't find many satisfying answers. I found a lot of questions, and I found that the literature in privacy was not very extensive. Much of it was quite old and didn't really reflect some of the realities that we were living through. And a little while later, Edward Snowden came up with his revelations that we were being surveilled at a mass scale. And that had a huge impact on me. It seemed to me that it was something very significant, and I was quite frustrated to find that philosophers weren't addressing that problem at all. So I was actually writing my dissertation on a different topic, and I decided to change. And I wrote my dissertation on the ethics and politics of privacy as a result of these experiences. And the more I researched privacy, the more alarmed I got at the situation and at how much privacy we are losing every day and how little we know about it and the consequences that we may face. So even though this project started as a very academic project, I had this sense of urgency that I wanted to write a book that could be read by many more people than just philosophers, and that could inform the public at large about these issues. And nevertheless, I wanted to write a book that was very philosophical, very political, that explained some of the relationships between, for instance, privacy and democracy, autonomy, and some of these concepts, including power. So the result is this book, and I hope that the book is the kind of book that I would have loved to be able to read when I first started getting interested in this topic, and I didn't find the kind of book that I was looking for. So that, yeah. The book starts with a chapter that is very much a narrative. It follows a person throughout a day just to illustrate how much privacy we're losing. And here, really, we can't underestimate the extent of the data economy. Even though I've been working on this for 6 years and I wrote this chapter, whenever I actually have to read it again, I'm still surprised, because data is something that's so abstract that we tend to forget the details of it. And it's very hard to keep in mind. We just, our psychology is not made for keeping these kind of really abstract things in mind. So a few examples that really shocked me were, for instance, if you have a smart car, whenever you get on your smart car, all kinds of things are being tracked on you. Some of them are more or less obvious, like where you go, and you can infer things like, you know, whether you go to a fertility clinic or an abortion clinic, or whether you are visiting a psychiatrist or sensitive things like that. But also things like the kind of music you listen to. Spotify is actually selling this data to bankers because bankers believe that they can infer your mood from the kind of music you listen to. So, you know, when next time you apply for a loan, your music tastes as recorded by your car may influence whether you get that loan or not, and what rate you get on it is really surprising. The seat on your car is tracking your weight and selling that information on, possibly to insurance companies. So if you get fat or slim, they might be concerned and you might have consequences. Another example that really shocked me, for instance, is the use of audio beacons. Whenever you go into a shop and there's music in the background, there are these audio beacons that are broadcasting. We don't hear them, but our phones do, and they record that. And the idea is that companies want to be able to triangulate your phone, your laptop, and you as an to make sure what influence they're having on you. So say if you listen to a radio ad in the morning of a product, and then you look it up online on your laptop, and then later on in the day you go to your local shop and buy it, that store wants to know that you listened to that ad and that you went to that store. And the way they do it is through these audio beacons that get not only in the shop but also in the radio ad. And these kind of things, most people don't know about it, and they're really ubiquitous. And as I will argue, they have a big impact in our political sphere. And actually, many times I get asked this question about, what was the most spooky thing that you found out within these examples? And the most spooky thing, I decided not to publish it, because it's so easy for just anyone to find out the person that they dislike and abuse that information, that I thought it was too risky to publish. But the fact that me, just being a philosopher, researching this, can find that out should be concerning enough, that there's something wrong with the kind of system we've implemented. The second chapter talks about how we came to this situation. It's a very extreme situation. And I think if we had told, our parents or ourselves 30 years ago, hey, what do you think about this system? Should we implement a system in which we just collect as much personal data about everyone and we just sell it to the highest bidder? Do you think that's a good idea? We would have probably said, no, that's crazy and that's super invasive. Just don't do it. So how did we allow this to happen? And I argue there were many elements involved, but a few were more important perhaps than others. One was the discovery, fundamentally by Google, that they could use this personal data, these traces that we left every time we interact with technology, to be able to target ads. And they could argue to publishers that these ads would be more effective, and so they could fund themselves. In 2001, Google was still just basically a startup, and they were having real trouble with funding. Some of the investors wanted to pull out, and it was very urgent for them to look for a way to fund themselves. And the fact that they did it with ads is very telling, because they were very aware of this problem, that if you depend on personalized ads or on ads of any kind as a search engine, your loyalty will not be to the users, and that was a problem. And in fact, the founders of Google, Brin and Larry Page, had written a paper in 1998 in which they explicitly said that this was a problem, and this was part of why Google was fantastic. It started as pretty much an academic pursuit, and they wanted it to remain academic, and a few years later, they sold that idea in order to fund themselves through ads. So that was one big part of it. Suddenly we started getting personalized ads in a scale that we had never seen before. Another element that became very important for the development of the data economy was 9/11. The United States government was really worried and ashamed that 9/11 happened. They wanted to make sure they could do everything that was possible for it not to ever happen again, even though that was a very unrealistic objective. And they figured that if they literally could make a copy of the data, a copy of all the data that was being gathered by companies like telecoms and Google and Yahoo and Skype and all these other companies, they might have a better chance at catching terrorists and particularly in preventing terrorist attacks. Now, it turns out that big data is just not the kind of method that is good at preventing terrorism, because terrorism is a very rare event. So big data is really good at finding out patterns within troves of data. So it's very good at trying to figure out what you will buy tomorrow, because there are billions of people buying things every day. But terrorism only happens every once in a while. And no matter how much data we could have had, for instance, we would have never been able to predict that somebody would use a pot to, say, commit the attacks on the Boston Marathon. That's just not the kind of thing that we can predict. So it turns out that, as I argued further on in the book, this kind of data economy also creates a lot of danger for national security purposes. And so it seems like it was a really bad idea. It was probably very well intentioned, but a bad idea. A third element that played into the development of the data economy is the idea and the narrative something outdated, that it used to be relevant, but it's not relevant anymore in the digital age. And of course, this narrative was very convenient to tech companies who made money from personal data. So Zuckerberg famously said that we had evolved privacy norms in 2010. Later on, of course, he backtracked when it seemed that that wasn't a very profitable point of view anymore. And we bought this idea for a variety of reasons. One reason is that the connection between losses and bad consequences became a lot more opaque in the digital age. So if you had gone, say, for a job interview 20 or 30 years ago, and the interviewer asked you, hey, do you plan to have kids anytime soon? It's sort of very obvious how your answer to that question might jeopardize your being hired or not. And it was very obvious what that person was trying to do, and that's why we made it illegal. Whereas today, you give up your data here and there. Some company, some data broker aggregates it, you never learned about it. That file gets sold on to prospective employers. And for all you know, you might be discriminated against for things like wanting to have children in the near future or for having a disease. And you would never know about it because it's very hard to police these things. And the company will certainly not tell you that's why they didn't hire you. And you will never make the connection that, 2 years ago, you read this book about the particular disease you have or about having children, and that is the reason why you didn't get the job. You'll never make that connection. And so in a way, the kind of cues that we have in offline world when our privacy gets violated are no longer there in the digital realm. It doesn't feel like anything to have your personal data collected. You don't bleed from it. You don't lose your breath. You don't observe any absence. And many times you don't even know that you've been the victim of discrimination. And so all these elements play together, allow the data economy to thrive. And 20 years later, here we are losing an incredible amount of data and really jeopardizing our democracies. And the third chapter is about the relationship between power and privacy. One of the things that I think is lacking in current philosophical debates is more reflection about power. And I think this is important because power has changed in relevant ways in the last few years. Sorry, there's a baby crying. Yeah, yay to a baby. And I take this analogy from Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell said that we should think about power as a kind of energy. And energy, one of the characteristics of energy is that it can transform itself from one kind into another. And power does the same thing. So if you have enough economic power, you can transform it into political power. If you have enough political power, you can transform it into military power, and so on. And we're very used to these kind of three very traditional kinds of power because they've been there for a long time and they played very important roles in history. And in the digital age, I argue there's this fourth kind of power that has also been there for a long time, but never at this scale. And this power has to do with the ability to forecast and influence people's behavior. And the more personal data you have, the more you have of this kind of power, which then you can transform into economic power or political power, and possibly even military power. And the reason why this power is so different from what we've had before is that we didn't have the tools to collect as much data as we do now, and we didn't have the tools to analyze as much data as we do today. And that sort of took us by surprise. Our litmus test, for instance, about whether a company was a monopoly or not is whether the company could increase its prices without losing any customers. But of course, companies like Google and Facebook are in theory free. And so our litmus test just failed. But in fact, our litmus test was wrong because it was just a particular case out of a more general principle. That is that whenever companies can impose kind of extreme or very unfair or exploitative practices on their customers without losing clients, whether that's prices or whether it's the amount of data collected, then that would that's a symptom that it might be a monopoly. And one of the sources of power in this way that I'm describing is, of course, the relationship between knowledge and power, which we've known for a while. So Francis Bacon famously argued that knowledge is power, meaning that the more you know about somebody, the more power you can have over them. And then Michel Foucault also argued that power is knowledge. And that aspect, I think, we tend to neglect very often, and is very relevant for the digital age. So it's not only the more you can influence their behavior and predict what they're going to do, but also the more power you have, the more you get to decide what counts as knowledge. And one of the things that is concerning about a company like Google is that they are getting to decide what counts as knowledge about us. So they have a file on you, and the same with data brokers, and they are sending this information all the time to other companies. Other companies are making decisions about you on the basis of this information, and they get to say what counts as knowledge about you. And many times this knowledge is actually outdated, or it's completely wrong. There was a good journalist, I think it was Julie Angwin, who dug out her file from data brokers, and she's a really good writer. She went to college, and in fact, her file said that she hadn't finished high school. And for all she knows, she might have been discriminated against for that reason, when it was in fact not true. So part of the solutions that I propose in this book try to fight against this asymmetry. So on the one hand, we have to make sure that these companies don't know that much about us. So we need to limit their knowledge about us. And on the other hand, we need to know more about them, because the more we know about them, the more we can do something about it. And at the moment, they know everything there is about us, and we know almost nothing about them, or very little about them. And one of the important elements in this play between privacy and power is autonomy. Autonomy, as you know, is the ability and the right to self-govern. And this right is relevant not only for individuals, but also for societies, because we want populations to have autonomy as well. And for the population to have autonomy, they need individuals to have autonomy. And having so much personal data out there and cultivating a culture of exposure is really threatening this autonomy. It's threatening it in many ways. One of the ways is, we've all heard about this, how companies are using personal data to try to influence people's views, including their votes. So data firms like Cambridge Analytica famously try to sway elections in many places in the world. And Cambridge Analytica is now gone, but we still have about 300 companies that are pretty similar, trying to do similar things. And whether they succeed or not is an important question, and we should address that. But the fact that they're trying is already very from the perspective of autonomy. And one of the practices that data scientists have that I find very concerning is the idea of replicating society and thinking with it. So the idea is that data scientists can create avatars of us all. And this is based on our personal data. They create profiles, and they use it a bit like a voodoo doll. They play with it, and they try to influence it one way or another. They see how the avatar reacts. And whenever the avatar reacts in the way they wanted it to react, then they try it on in flesh and blood people. And depending on how that goes, they tweak the model and then try it again. And this kind of manipulation seems like it's not a very good idea for the purposes of enhancing autonomy. Another way in which autonomy is being jeopardized is just by having this sheer amount of surveillance. People are influenced by it. So people typically don't like to be watched. And when we know we are being watched, we act differently. So anything from self-censoring online, and there is a lot of research that shows how this is happening, including in writers not writing about certain topics, not even researching certain topics, because we know we are being surveilled. And this has all kinds of effects in creativity, but also independent thinking. And I also worry about the way we are raising children and young people. And these people are not having enough opportunities to try out new ideas, to be themselves, to make mistakes without knowing that they're being recorded and that these mistakes might be held against them in the future. And then I have a discussion about how this is relevant for liberal democracy and how liberal democracy necessitates a kind of private space, private sphere in which we can be ourselves. And one phrase that I really like about Thomas Nagel is that everybody has a right to commit murder in their imagination once in a while. Have a culture of exposure in which we are pushing people to be as transparent as possible, and we're defending that as a virtue, when in fact it creates all kind of unnecessary conflicts in the public sphere. And we are kind of suffocating independent thinking that way. The fourth chapter argues that we should think about personal data as a kind of toxic asset. Right up until now, we have thought of it as a very positive economic asset, but really every personal data point is a liability, is a potential data breach, a potential lawsuit, and personal data is much more dangerous than we have thought it to be until now. And I argue that it's poisoning individuals by exposing us to all kinds of data-related harms like extortion, like discrimination. I carried out a survey recently with a colleague, Sian Brook, and we found out that 92% of people have had some kind of bad experience online related to privacy. So sometimes this is identity theft, sometimes it's being the subject of spyware, all kinds of things. And so this has really bad consequences in people's lives for their well-being. It's also poisoning institutions, because every potential personal data point is a potential liability, a potential lawsuit or fee or whatnot. But it's poisoning societies in different ways. One of the ways is that it's undermining our equality. So you and I are not being treated as equals anymore online, even if we were in the same country. For instance, if you're a man, you would be shown ads for higher paying jobs than me. And depending on what your laptop is, whether it's Mac or Windows, you probably pay a different price for the same kind of seat on the airplane. And we wait different times when we call customer service, depending on our personal data. And the examples just go on and on and on. We're just not being treated as equal citizens anymore. Also, personalized content. Personalized sounds very privileged, like VIP treatment, but in fact, it's just really targeting your own mind many times in ways that are against your best interest. So one of the effects it has is that it's creating this polarization, and I won't get too much into that because I think that's something that everybody has heard by now, and we're just seeing more and more demonstrations real live in the news, more and more alarming of what polarization can do. So in fact, we've fractured the public sphere in ways that make it the case that journalists and academics and ordinary citizens cannot criticize what politicians are saying, because whenever there's elections, they have literally 6 million different ads, which are very, very different, as opposed to just one content that everybody can see and everybody can talk about, and we can share our reality. Particularly in these times of pandemic, we access reality through our screens. So if we see completely different information and see the world very, very differently, then it will be very hard to have a rational discussion about these issues. And one of the things that I discuss in the book to illustrate how toxic personal data can be is the use of personal data during the Second World War. One of the first things that the Nazis did when they invaded a city was go to the registry, because that's where the data was held. And there's a study that compares the country that had most data collected about its citizens, and that was the Netherlands, versus the country that had less data collected about its citizens, which was France. France in 1872 had made a conscious decision not to collect data, particularly data about religious affiliation. And the Netherlands had a guy called Lens, who was a fan of statistics. He was one of the pioneers of population statistics. He invented the ID card, and he wanted to create a system that followed people from cradle to grave. That's a direct quote. And the result was that in the Netherlands, the Nazis found and killed about 75% of the Jewish population, whereas in France, they found and killed 25% of the Jewish population. And this difference is in hundreds of thousands of people. one particular story that really struck me from that time was one related to Amsterdam. In 1943, as a resistance cell in Amsterdam decided to try to destroy the archive, the registry in Amsterdam city, in order to try to save as many Jewish people as possible. They went into the registry, they set fire on the files, and they had a deal with the fire department. They had some accomplices there, and the fire department was going to arrive as late as possible, and that they were going to use more water than necessary to destroy as many records as possible. Unfortunately, they were very unsuccessful. Not only did they get caught and killed, but also they only managed to destroy about 15% of the records. And the Nazis found 70,000 Jews in Amsterdam. And I think there are two lessons from this story. One is that the Dutch had collected much more personal data than they needed. And the second was that they didn't have an easy way to delete that data in the event of an emergency. And we are making both of those mistakes as I've seen before. We are building the perfect structure for a dictatorship that might be unbeatable. And we should be much more careful about that than we have been so far. Just like we knew, for example, that a pandemic was coming, and academics have been saying it for years, and we could have been a lot more prepared than we were. We know that, for instance, a massive cyber attack is coming. And whenever that happens, we can be in real trouble if there's too much personal data that can be hacked and used against us. So that's kind of my diagnosis and the problem. In the last two chapters, I come up with a proposal and solutions. I wanted this not to be only a criticism or just more narrative about what's wrong with tech. We all know there's a lot wrong with tech, but how the hell do we get out of this mess? So I think we need regulation, and there's no way around that. But I think that individuals have a big role to play in this, partly because we have been cultivating a culture of exposure, and we need to cultivate a culture of privacy. So what we need to do in terms of regulation is, in the book is a lot more detailed, so I have something like 20 suggestions. But the most important ones, just to have a summary, is we should ban trades in personal data. Even in the most capitalist societies, that should be outside of the market. So typically votes, people, the results of sports matches, and we should add personal data to that list. It's just too dangerous to sell personal data to the highest bidder. At the moment, for instance, we are allowing data brokers to sell lists of people who have been the victims of rape, to sell lists about people who have lost a kid in an accident, and we are allowing them to profit from this very sensitive information. And I find that really morally repugnant and very dangerous for the individuals. So in addition to banning the selling and buying of personal data, we should ban personalized content and ads. The kind of advantage that we get from that is minimal. We can get it in other ways, and the disadvantage is huge. So a lot of people say, well, but I don't want to see ads that I'm not interested in. And I understand that, I don't want to see ads of tractors either, or whatever it is. But in order to show us ads that are meaningful, we don't have to know everything about you. So suppose you're looking for a backpack and you search online for a backpack. That's the only thing we need to know about you to show you ads that contain backpacks. We don't need to know whether you're gay or straight, fat or slim, rich or poor, whether you have one disease or another, or you haven't paid your loans. We only need to know that you're looking for a backpack. A third thing that we should do is to implement fiduciary duties. Those are duties that are implemented in professional relationships of asymmetry, in which the client is very vulnerable to the professional. Examples include doctors and patients, lawyers and clients, financial advisors and clients. And in these relationships, there's something very important being entrusted to the professional, and the professional should only use it in the interest of the client and never against that person. So our personal data, if anybody wants to collect or manage our personal data, that's fine, but they have to agree that there's a duty of care towards us, and that data can never be used against us. And what I argue is that, if you want to be a doctor, say you want to be a doctor because you're interested in the human body, you really like cutting people up and seeing what's inside, that's fine. but you still have to have a duty of responsibility. And if you're not willing to take on that duty, then you shouldn't be a doctor. And in the same way, if companies don't want to accept that duty of care towards data subjects, kind of job. Other examples include we should really improve our cybersecurity measures. At the moment, we have built the internet to be really insecure so that we can collect as much data as possible. And that makes it incredibly insecure. And it's just a matter of time before we get a massive cyber attack. If, say, Russian hackers were to hack just 10% of our electrical appliances and turn them on at the same time, they would bring down the electrical grid. Now imagine a situation in which we're in lockdown and then the electric grid comes down. It would be catastrophic. And these attacks are happening right now during the pandemic. So it's not something imaginary, it's not something exaggerated. The last chapter is just about what individuals can do. And you can imagine some of the advice, but basically contact your political representatives and tell them that you care about privacy and ask them what they're doing towards privacy. Choose privacy-friendly options, such as DuckDuckGo instead of Google search, Proton Mail instead of Gmail, Signal instead of WhatsApp. That's pretty relevant these days. Just try to make it heard. And I have a discussion of how people putting pressure on companies and governments really works much better than we think. And companies are really sensitive about these changes. And a lot of companies are realizing that privacy can actually be a competitive advantage. And this is going to be something crucial for the development of more privacy-friendly products. And just to end, some people think that it's kind of radical to say that we should end the data economy. It earns a lot of people a lot of money, and it's been here for a little while, so we're kind of used to it. But I think that what's radical is to have a business model that depends on the systematic and massive violation of people's rights. And we have changed economic systems in the past because they were unacceptable from a rights perspective, and we should do it again. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Well, I think, Carissa, you're entitled to a virtual and physical clap.
Thank you.
It's never as good as when you're with the actual people in a real room, but that's the best we can do, unfortunately. So thank you very much. This was very interesting. I think you provide like a very good overview of the book. You also made me concerned because based on what I've been listening on Spotify these days, I really wonder what kind of financial services a banker will sell me, but I won't say more about that for now. So now we have we will have intervention from two discussants. So the first person is Sébastien Gambs, who is a professor in computer science at the Université du Québec à Montreal, and also the Canada Research Chair in Privacy Preserving and Ethical Analysis of Big Data. So his main research topics are on the protection of privacy, with a particularly strong focus on location privacy. So Sébastien, if you want to say a few words, so you have about 5 to 10 minutes to raise a few discussion points, comments, or questions on Carissa's talk.
Yeah. So first, I would like to thank Carissa because I read the book, and I think as you say, the book is for somebody that wants to know more about digital privacy, has no idea about it, and wants to have a really good introduction on a lot of I would say issue. I think it's really a good introduction, and I really like the way you summarize it also during the talks. I have a few questions for you about basically I want to use your expertise and ideas. Just so my question is basically about whether some ideas that you think we should do or not. So one of the first questions I have is, a lot of people as work on privacy enhancing technology, where often the objective is to say that you are talking about personalized service, that the current architecture or most digital service online is not privacy friendly, but if you are a bit imaginative on the way you design the services or the solution, maybe by using some advanced crypto or changing the distribution of data or adding more control, then you could arrive to some situation where you still get the personalized service, but you don't have a central collection of data, or it's more easy to delete the data. So I wonder if this direction is one you think is interesting in the sense of having a, oh. Sorry, it's not a baby, but it's okay. So maybe I will let you with this first question, and I will ask mine later.
So should I answer the question now?
Yeah, go ahead. Just maybe briefly that question, and then we'll take like the rest of Sébastien's comment and Mario's comment, and then you can reply if you want, just until the dogs and babies finish to do whatever they need to do. Confinement is hard. We've been confined in Quebec.
The joys of pandemic life. So thanks for the question. That's a really good question. So on the one hand, yes, I find it promising, and I think we have to invest much more in this kind of technology. And if we kind of put pressure on governments and companies that we're just not willing to deal with this personal data invasion anymore, I think that's going to happen. And in some cases, it's going to be a great solution. So one of the examples I give in the book is differential privacy, which is still very underdeveloped and it's still not usable because it's too complex. But I think the theory of it is fantastic. So here's an example just to illustrate it. Suppose you want to know who voted for Trump, and but this is very sensitive information, and so you don't want to collect that information in the first place. So ordinarily you would just like call up a few thousand people and ask them. But if you work with differential privacy, you would call a few thousand people and then you would ask them, okay, flip a coin. If it's heads, tell me the truth. If it's tails, flip a coin again. If it's heads, tell me the truth. And if it's tails, lie to me and don't ever tell me how the coin landed. And so there you have a case in which you know that 75% of your responses are true and 25% of your responses are false. So you can statistically adjust for that. And you get a very accurate statistic response. And yet every individual that answers that survey has plausible deniability in that we don't know whether they actually voted for Trump or not. In some cases, though, I still worry. Like sometimes when we go after very personal data, we can also, it can have bad effects collectively. So, well, that's one of the points of the book, that privacy is actually not individual, but it's collective. And every time we expose ourselves, we expose others. So for instance, if you expose where you live, you expose your neighbors. If you expose your genetic makeup, you expose your family and so on. And in that way, I don't know, find out that women have this tendency, whatever it is, and we could still discriminate against women for that, even though we don't know that that's true about any particular. I still think that we need to think more about this collective aspect of privacy. But in short, yes, I think some of these new methods are very, very promising, and I think that's where the future is going.
Okay, thank you. So Sébastien, if it's fine now, do you want to finish your comment?
Yeah, so I'm sorry for the interruption. So another question that I had was with respect to regulation. So as you say, regulation is something I think we need for privacy. And I wanted to know if you think that the GDPR, for instance, is going far enough, or if not, what do you think is missing even in the regulation? And maybe just picking up on your example, I wonder if in the regulation we should have also the right to lie, which if I have myself, I think I'm asked sensitive information, which is not necessary for the service. You think we should enshrine in the law really a right to lie for people, like you say, with a randomized response? So maybe that's was my second question. Is the regulation like GDPR good enough, or if not, what is missing? And maybe the third comment or question that I would have, because the seminar is dedicated to ethics of AI. What is your, as you say, there is a link with autonomy and also with fairness. Do you think also this aspect should be put in the regulation for privacy as being something which is defined and the rights are also defined there? Or do you think that in particular for artificial intelligence, if you talk to people doing artificial intelligence and you say you will have less data because it has an effect on privacy, a lot of companies and people will complain that this will hurt their business model. So I wonder what you have to say also to them. And so maybe this is my third comment or question.
Thank you. Fantastic question.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Carissa and Sébastien. If you don't mind, we'll take Mario's comment and then I will offer you an opportunity to reply to both. Thank you, and sorry about that. Okay, so now our second comment will come from Mario Quentin, who is the founder and chief data strategist at Prodago, which is a firm that provides services to help operationalize data governance. But according to your website, Mario, you also have many other hats, including being a programmer, an analyst, and an architect. So I think I'm really looking forward to your comment. I think it will be very interesting to have your perspective that is not necessarily strictly an academic or academic research-oriented perspective. So please go ahead. You have 5 to 10 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you, Dominique, and thank you, Carissa, for your great perspective and insights on privacy and ethical usage of data. I'm the data strategist for Prodago. At Prodago, we're working with multiple organizations who wants to use data to support their business objective, and they want to use data in innovative way, and they increasingly understand that they need to be responsible in doing this. They understand this. Now, the challenge they have is how must they do this? How can they ensure they act responsibly? So what they do is they can align on ethical principle declarations such as the Montreal Declaration that we have here, which is a great foundational element, great alignment on what's ethical or non-ethical and usage of data and key anchor point. They can decide to align on ethical standards, such as the one we have here in Canada from the CIO Strategy Council, the ethical design and usage of automated systems. So organization can decide to align on standards such as this one. They can also themselves, as organization, defines their own ethical principles and define what they consider to be ethical usage of data. Now, the challenge we see in organization in doing this is how can they enforce this? How can they turn principles on what's ethical or non-ethical in terms of usage of data, how they can turn this into real action, real accountabilities, and real controls within organization in order to align. And we see this as a real challenge on which organizations are struggling. So they understand that ethical principles are required by them, but they need to operationalize it. They need their design processes around creation and usage of AI to be governed. So for example, you are developing AI model. So how do you ensure that the data sources you use to create your model are fair? So the fairness of data sources is critical for organization. From a privacy perspective, a bank would decide to use Facebook data in order to take a credit decision. An organization needs to take a position on is that allowed or not. Now the challenge is, when you decide to ensure data source fairness, the challenge they have is how do you do that? Okay, you need to define, an organization needs to define a list of fair data sources. You need control points to define, each individual, each group who wants to use data, how do they align? How do you monitor this? How do you audit these processes? So this is a real challenge for organization, this type of stuff. Ensuring training data set does not contain any bias. Who check this? What are the thresholds? How do you act on this? The decision taken through models need to be adequately explainable. Same thing, okay? You want to ensure if you take a credit decision, you need this to be adequately explainable. In some in some contexts, the explainability requirements are regulated. You need, in the States, you need to be able, a bank needs to be able to explain a credit decision taken through AI processes. But how do you put this in motion? How do you define the level of human involvement in reviewing decision? So the key elements I'm raising here is not only there's a need to define as a society what we accept, what we think is ethical in terms of data usage, but we need to rapidly think in terms of enforceable controls. Okay, we need to support and provide alignment to organizations on which they can act. So long introduction, but my question, I guess, for you, Carissa, and for the audience is, what do you see as actionable element that us as a society should take in order to support this operational alignment beyond the ethical principles?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, all right. Okay, so yes, please go ahead, Carissa. Sorry.
Okay, I'll go in order just because my memory is better that way. So is it GDPR enough? No, it's not enough. Clearly, it's not enough. I mean, in the last few years, how many scandals we've seen. So that's just enough evidence to show that's not enough. But one thing that is very bad is the model of consent. It completely doesn't work. It's too burdensome for individuals. And also there's no such thing as meaningful consent involved with big data. First, because it's so hard to understand. Even the people who program these things don't understand and can't know where the data is going to end up. So how can you possibly consent to a treatment of your data when you don't understand the consequences of that or who will end up with your data? And also because what moral authority do I have to consent to sell my data when that data involves data about you and when it can be used to thwart our elections? Like how, who am I to consent to that? So I think the default should be no data collection, and people, and certainly certain kinds of data collection, certain kinds of treatment of data should be banned. And individuals would have to effortfully opt in to have certain kinds of data collected instead of the reverse. And it would make much more sense, because now every time you don't want your data collected, you have to go and click like 20 things in every website, which is completely nonsensical. Whether if that was the default and you would have to sign up for data collection, then you would only need to do it once, and then they could justifiably remember you, right? So it makes a lot more sense than the reverse. So that's one thing. And then all the rest of things like fiduciary duties and banning data trades, none of that is in the GDPR. What would I say to businesses who would say that, this is going to hurt their business model? There are two responses. First, they're a business model that shouldn't exist, right? So if you're a slave owner and you say that, banishing slavery is going to hurt your business model, the response is you should look for a business model that is ethical. So that's one thing. But furthermore, I think in many cases, many businesses are underestimating the benefits that regulation would have for them. So the car industry famously rejected seatbelts, and they really, really kind of opposed the resistance to it. They said they were ugly, they were uncomfortable, and people would hate them. And actually, people were pretty happy to be safer and not to be killed in car crashes. So in the same way, businesses are underestimating the importance that privacy will have for people trusting their services and not only using them because we feel like we don't have a choice or because our social relations are pushing us there, but because we actually want to, because we enjoy it, because we feel safe, because we feel like we're being treated fairly. How can we make companies accountable? It's not going to be easy, and there's no easy answer, but here are two suggestions that might be helpful. One is that we have a lot to learn from medical ethics in the way we have regulated medicine, not only in our successes, but also in our failures. We have failed to regulate big pharma in important ways, and we have successfully regulated other parts of medicine. One thing that I think will be very important is to have ethics committees that are completely independent, that cannot be fired for their opinions, because in things like, you know, whether something is fair or not, you can't necessarily codify everything. Ethics is not that simple. Otherwise, we could just design an algorithm and then it could just do its thing, right? But we don't work like that. So we need people, and we need stakeholders, and we need lawyers, and we need ethicists, and we need anthropologists and sociologists and politologists to talk about these things and come to a consensus of what is fair and what isn't. And I don't think we can substitute for that right now. Another thing that will be incredibly important is auditing. And they're already, we can already see emerging companies and consulting companies that are specializing in auditing algorithms. And many companies are very keen on having this done to them and seeing whether the algorithm is biased or not, and whether it discriminates or not, because you know, they don't want bad surprises when they let loose these algorithms in the world. And one of the things that I've been arguing for, and I've been wanting to write about it, but I haven't found the time, is the need to do randomized control trials on algorithms, just like we do on drugs. We would never allow a drug to go out into the world before we performed a randomized control trial on it. And some of these algorithms have devastating consequences for people, absolutely devastating. And for these kind of algorithms, we shouldn't allow them to go out into the world without first having been through pretty rigorous randomized control trials.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for these answers and all the discussion so far. So I think we're at the point where we can open the discussion to questions from the participants. So I will just repeat the way we proceed usually. So if you want to ask a question, please write your name in the chat, and then I will give you an opportunity to ask that question. If you write a question in the chat, then I will read your question. And once again, donc, nous essayons de faire en sorte que cet événement soit le plus bilingue possible. Donc, si vous souhaitez poser une question en français, n'hésitez pas à le faire et je la traduirai pour Carissa, et je traduirai aussi sa réponse si besoin est. Okay, so I was just saying you can also write your questions in French, and don't worry, Carissa, I will translate in both directions if need be. So I think I already have some people that have signaled their intention to ask a question. So let me start. I hope I'm not missing anyone, but let me start with Asma Emmer, who is the director of the AI for Cybersecurity Laboratory at the University of Montreal. Esma, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you very much,
Perfect.
Dominic. And thank you very much for your talk, Carissa. That was a great talk. I just have a question for you, if I may.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So, Carissa, examples of AI gone wrong are increasingly making the headlines these days, okay? So, for example, rather than seeing privacy by design, we're seeing dark by design. It's just crazy these days. And my question is the following. I mean, I'm more interested in bias, because typically bias injects itself into the AI process in one of the three ways, either biased in design or biased in data or biased in selection, right? But my question is the following. Does this mean that the promise of AI is nothing more than a dream if we speak about ethics and bias? I mean, how do you see every AI deployment should include checks, balances, and quality controls to mitigate bias before it impacts the outputs? How would you see this?
That's a really good question. I really like a sentence written by my colleague, Mike Woolridge, who's head of the computer science department at Oxford. And
I know Mike, yeah.
Okay.
And I know Nick Jennings as well. He's a good friend of mine.
Okay, cool. So Mike says that what AI needs more than anything is an injection of humility or something like that, something to that effect. And I think that's true. You know, it's not that AI is just like rubbish and we should just like chuck it and forget about it. But it's not that it's a magic wand and it's going to be make everything better automatically. And if you can use AI, it's obviously better than not. It's something in between. It's like, okay, sometimes it might be helpful for certain kinds of things, but we need to be very careful. And I think one of the crucial things is going to be randomized control trials, because that's the only way that you can really see whether algorithms, for instance, are being actually accurate or are creating self-fulfilling prophecies. And it's not easy to see it in the lab with the same kind of data. And something that I worry about is the kind of bias that is inserted in the data, because it's very hard to produce data that is unbiased. And because more and more, I think we're seeing a trend towards companies sharing data and using the same kind of data. So if everybody uses the same kind of data and everybody has the same bias, it might be very hard to detect it, and it might be very pernicious in a way that it inserts itself into the system. But it's essentially, we need to audit algorithms better. And for instance, there's a company called Éthique Consulting that is doing that and is being very successful. And we need to subject algorithms that make important decisions to randomized control trial.
Yeah, but Carissa, thank you. But I just want to point out something else. For example, if you look at the Amazon case for the H&R, they were downgrading women for more than 4 years. I mean, between 2014 and 2018. And at the end, they just found out that the bias was there because the guy who has already, established this algorithm put that bias. So, you know, these kind of things are really hard to detect, right?
Yeah, so, well, regarding the Amazon algorithm, to the best of my knowledge, and I might be wrong, but the way I read it in the press, and if you know more, please send me the details because I'm interested. And that algorithm, I thought, had never actually been implemented to actually hire people.
Really?
But maybe I'm wrong. But in any case, many algorithms have been implemented and have hurt people. One of my favorite, one of the most important examples I've come across is the Michigan Unemployment Agency using an algorithm to detect fraud and accusing 20,000 people unfairly of fraud, people who didn't have a job and who lost their houses, lost their families, totally wrecked their lives. And it turned out that the algorithm was wrong 93% of the time. So in these cases, I think we need to find justice and need to find ways of compensating people. And in a sense, you can't compensate a person for having lost their family. So we need to make sure that we don't use that algorithm. Happen like this. At the moment, people are not being compensated adequately.
Yeah, I will find out more about the Amazon case and let you know. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Esma.
Merci.
Now I have a question from a gentleman or lady that calls him or herself Z. Dot. So the question is as follows. Can you give an example of where the people's will to change conditions that were unfavorable to them in a system led to a complete redesign of that system? So I understand that to be sort of a question about perhaps a success story where we were able to design an IT system in an ethical way because there was the will from the people that are using the system, or the will was there.
Well, regarding IT, it's harder to find cases. I mean, Wikipedia is a nice case. At some point, Wikipedia was about to become something like Facebook. They were going to commercialize it. And thanks to a Spanish team, it's a really nice story. And I think it's published by Wired, if you look it up. Now, you know, it's Wikipedia's anniversary, so it's a good time to look it up. And how it became this amazing project that is free and so on and so forth. But just in the past, we have changed so many things. Like if you told somebody in the 1850s that we would have jobs and 8-hour shifts and holidays and 5-day weeks and things like that, they would think it's like unbelievable. And we've changed things through pressure, and we've earned and gained a lot of rights throughout time. Obviously, the UN Declaration of Rights. There are so many positive changes that we can see, and that people had an incredible role to play just by pushing.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now I have a question from Alexandre Mete. You can also see it in the chat, I think. So the question is as follows. How can we promote regulation when looking at citizens' behavior that seems to embrace surveillance culture? For example, voluntary using more and more surveillance tracking devices like smart speakers, smart cameras, fitness trackers, etc.
So one thing is to make people more aware of the risks they're incurring in. And if the survey I carried out is correct and 92% of people have had some kind of bad experience, this is going to be easier and easier, because either it's happened to you or it's happened to a friend. And I don't know if it's happened to you, but like identity theft is becoming incredibly common, and many times you lose a lot of money and you lose a lot of time trying to fix it. So that's one way in which we will become more privacy conscious. But another thing is that, you know, we don't really embrace surveillance culture. I mean, we have an impulse to share and to connect and to track things. But if you gave like people two devices, say you have a smart camera and it collects all your personal data, it files your facial print, and then it uses it to train algorithms in China, or you can have this smart camera that doesn't do that. Which one would you choose? I think it's a no-brainer. People would choose no surveillance. And it's just because we don't have the alternative at the moment. So we have to incentivize that alternative, partly by buying and choosing products that are more privacy friendly, but also by funding.
Okay, we missed just the last part of your last sentence, I think.
Oh,
that we
should choose privacy-friendly options and also fund them in order to incentivize this.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Perhaps it's a point where I could also ask a question that is related to that. So first, I just want to say, and there are plenty of other people in the chat, so we'll get to you. We have quite a lot of time left. But I just want to say first, I also really enjoyed the book. I think it's a very good book to make sense of issues regarding privacy and have some sort of an introduction. But it's also like, especially in the 5th chapter, I think, where you make some suggestions. I really enjoyed that chapter. So I did not read it. I've listened to it as an audiobook, but because you make suggestions that are broad enough, I think, to speak to different types of audiences and apply in different legal frameworks. But it's also precise. It's also more precise than just like a broad moral principle that sometimes it's more difficult to operationalize or to put in practice. And so clearly I agree with a lot of the criticism or the issue you raise in the book. But one question, however, I add is that to some extent, personal data collection and enforcement of privacy have contributed to some form of innovation or the development of some products that we consider useful today. I know that you speak a bit about innovation in the book, but not in the way that I'm thinking of right now. So if we were to have tougher laws or regulation against to protect privacy better, it's possible that we would have to make some trade-offs. Now, I just want to be very clear. I think that like the way that we're using personal data today is problematic. It's not legitimate. We should change our practices. So I completely agree with that. But I think the type of trade-offs that we should be making should be more acknowledged. So perhaps some technological developments that are available today in terms of smart equipment or natural language processing, machine learning models would not have come as fast as what we had today. And perhaps if we're much tougher on privacy, we may have to wait a few decades more or 5 years or 10 years more to see the type of technology that we may see in a few years from now. So I was just curious to know, like, do you see any trade-offs, and what are they? So what are the trade-offs that we have to make if we want to protect privacy better? Not just the advantages, not just the gains in terms of power, because that we know that there are issues of powers and we can gain in powers and legitimacy if privacy is protected better. But what kind of trade-offs would we have to make?
That's a really good question. And ideally, I would want to know like a particular kind of technology that we wouldn't have if it were not for the data economy.
Well, natural language processing, I think, smart assistants.
Okay, smart assistants. So I don't know, maybe my standards are very high, but I find smart assistants incredibly stupid and unhelpful.
They would be even much more stupid.
Yeah, I don't use them at all. So like, would I trade of weight to have Siri for not having the risk of the perfect authoritarian regime? Sure, yeah, I would. I mean, for me, that's not like a big sacrifice. But there are other responses. One is that much of the things that we have developed with personal data we could have had developed with personal data without selling and buying personal data. So if data brokers didn't exist, I mean, I don't think the data that data brokers have has been the motor of innovation. I really don't think that's the case. So already, like, we could get rid of a huge part of the data economy that has nothing to do with innovation. Secondly, I do think that we're at a point at which we are emphasizing the value of data too much. So when we have a bad algorithm, there's this kind of hope that if we throw enough personal data at it, somehow it will become magically smart. And we are reaching kind of limits in which, well, these things are not getting all that smart with much more data. So I do think that in the future, better AI will need less data, because better AI will be better at understanding rather than just correlations. And it will be better at learning in the way that children learn. So children, you know, you only have to tell them a few times something and they learn it. And not only do they remember it, but they can apply it to different cases. Whereas now we have to give an AI like hundreds and millions of examples. And even then it can't really generalize it. And so I do think that by not have too much personal data, we might actually be pushing them to develop AI in a way that it is much more promising. But furthermore, you know, a lot of AI will deal with data that is not personal data. So in the case of like AlphaGo, you know, playing the game of Go and then maybe applying it to something else. Another example that I give in the book is the search for new antibiotics and how we're using all this data to analyze molecules. And that's fantastic, you know, and that has nothing to do with personal data. So a lot of the most important innovations that we want to get at will not use personal data. There might be some trade-offs, but I haven't found evidence that the trade-off is going to be very expensive for us.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much. I have another question, but I'll wait a bit and see if it fits with the other thing we'll get to in the discussion. But I remember at that, so almost no trade-off, which is always a good news. Okay, so next person in the list would be, if I'm not mistaken, would be Sylvain Auclair. So welcome, Sylvain, and please go ahead if you want to ask a question.
Thank you for your brilliant presentation and your book. One of the most innovative aspects of your position, I think, is the collective perspective of privacy. Would you go so far as to say that people have a duty not to disclose some personal information to the extent that this information can be used for predictive analytics and negatively affect other people? If so, how to relate this duty to with individual rights?
Thank you. That's a really good question. So the answer is not in the book. It's not in this book. It's in the next book, which is going to be an academic book about privacy. So I take the view that if you think that all rights have a correlative duty, then it's not always the case that we have a duty not to disclose personal information. Sometimes it will be the case. So for instance, if you know a person is being persecuted by the mob, and if you tell the mob where they are, well, they're gonna get killed, then you might have a duty not to disclose that information because there is a correlative person who has a right. But in many cases, we don't exactly know whether there's a person that has a right and exactly how the personal data that we're disclosing will pan out, and it may be very indirect. So in the book, I talk about obligations as opposed to duty. So in that sense, I think, reasons not to. Safia, sorry, I think your mic is on.
Yeah, I muted her. Sorry about that.
No worries. So we have reasons not to disclose our data, and we have moral obligations, but I don't call them a duty just because there isn't necessarily a correlative right by anyone. And the kind of thing that I have in mind is, for instance, imagine that we are in a very in a totalitarian regime that is against, say, gay people. If everybody says, if everybody who's straight says that they're straight, to make sure that they don't run into trouble, then the government will more easily infer who might be gay, or we might be pushing people into lying, and that can get them into all sorts of harms and inauthenticity and stuff. So I do think that as individuals, we have obligations to cultivate a culture of privacy, and that means not disclosing too much information about us, particularly to companies and government, particularly when our government is not to trust, and not disclosing things about other people that you don't know when it can have a very bad effect. So here's an example. I was born in Mexico, and Mexico, as you know, sometimes is a pretty dangerous country. And in one case, it turned out that there was this person who was being persecuted by a cartel for whatever reason. And somebody took a picture of them and uploaded it. Now, this person never imagined that they could be jeopardizing a person's life to that extent. But it just shows that oftentimes when we disclose personal information, we just don't know what we're doing. And so there is an argument to err on the side of caution.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question is from Jennifer Garrard.
Yes, thank you very much, Dominique. And thank you so much, Carissa, for that amazing talk. And I really look forward to reading the book as soon as I can. I wanted to ask about sort of the context of digital surveillance in the COVID-19 pandemic, because I do see it as something that people are talking about much more transparently than I've seen in the past. And people who maybe had not been concerned or as concerned about these types of issues are all of a sudden very interested in these debates on, you know, the virtues of data protection, data privacy, et cetera. And I guess more specifically, I'm really interested in the Google Apple exposure notification system and all these sort of contact tracing. And I mean, I know that they're being more open about, you know, where data is being stored, for how long data is being kept. So some of the concerns that come up quite a bit with that type of surveillance program. But I guess my own personal fear is that this type of activity, and in a context where it's being framed almost as if, you know, giving your data, but for the greater good to help control the pandemic, could almost run the risk of normalizing digital surveillance. So I'm just curious your perspective on that. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a fascinating case. I mean, scary, but fascinating from a theoretical perspective. And one thing to keep in mind is that crises are always used by power to enhance their own power. And this is exactly what happened in 9/11, and we're seeing it happening exactly the same way in the coronavirus pandemic. And the pandemic has been used as an opportunity to experiment with AI and to collect more data than we would otherwise. And in some cases, it's very justified. In some cases, it's very questionable. In some cases, it's justified and then it's misused. So for instance, in the UK, data that was used in pubs to just record who's in and out just for the purposes of the pandemic then got sold to data brokers. And that's the kind of thing that really erodes trust. And again, a company like Palantir has been involved with the NHS in the UK and with the Center for Disease Control in the US. And for instance, the NHS has given Palantir data not only about things like health records, but also jail records, and which is kind of very surprising. And there hasn't been an explanation as to why Palantir needed that data for the purposes of the pandemic. So it's something that we need to be very careful about. Like, the bad news is that there's a lot of that, and we have regressed. Democracy has regressed during the pandemic, and it's really kind of concerning. The good news is that I've seen more resistance than I imagined. And here, you know, a case is the Google and Apple case, which on the one hand is optimistic because people were kind of outraged and they were distrustful, and that mattered and that had an effect, and that's good. But on the other hand, it's kind of concerning that Google and Apple can have so much power that they can basically overpower governments like the UK government and say, no, you have to do the app this way. And in this case, it favored us as users, and that's a great thing. But what if tomorrow it doesn't favor us? And it just makes me feel like we're really vulnerable to these companies right now. And we better get our act together as democratic societies before it's too late.
Thank you. Thank you. How does the saying goes? We are trading these treating this big tech corporation as if they were gods and were just putting us at the mercies of demons or something like that. No, I think that has been said many times about big tech. Okay, the next question comes from AJ Maxwell.
Hi, yeah. Do you want me to turn on my camera or?
If you want to, that's your decision.
All right. So I also wrote it in the chat just in case. But I just wanted to know, Carissa, first of all, amazing talk. Thank you so much. I was just curious, you talked a lot about these randomized control trials for artificial intelligence. And I was just curious, like, how would that look in practice? Like, are we talking about, I mean, there's a sort of standard way to sort of randomize and control the data that you're training on and testing on by using something like what's called like a k-fold scheme, where you randomly sample or bootstrap from your algorithm to see how it changes through different training schemes. But are you also talking more about the algorithm itself that we use? You know, a lot of people sort of like in this sort of day and age, we're talking about, oh, you know, deep learning is the thing, and like deep learning, you know, neural network graphs are amazing, and we just sort of throw like the next greatest thing at a problem. And are you talking about that as well, like stopping and asking, like, what's the tool that I want to use and why, and how could it change based on my perceptions of the problem?
So I'm talking about everything. A project should be looked at from the point of view of ethics from the start. It's like at the beginning, like, do we actually need this? Is it going to solve a problem, or are we just like developing tech for the sake of tech and jeopardizing people? Let's suppose we do need it. Okay, at what price is, you know, not only economic, but also ecologic and politically, and, you know, is it going to be worth it? And let's say like we run a full analysis and it seems really promising. Then, okay, we design the algorithm with all these things in mind, but then we have to see how it works, not in the lab, not in models, but in actual people before we set it into the real world. So here's an example. Recently, I was asked about a school that wanted to try out an algorithm for learning and things like that. And they were very excited and they thought it was going to be great, and the algorithm was going to track students' attention and all these kind of things. And this has never been tested outside the lab. So instead of just going and, you know, seeing how it works in the school for a year, and if it doesn't work well, then you've harmed those students for a year who didn't have a choice. Then, you know, make it optional, make it a thing that you do in the afternoon as an extra, so that you don't harm students and you don't take away anything of the actual education. And say you have two groups that on top of their studies, just get together for 2 hours in the afternoon or for an hour, one group with no AI and one group with AI. You study it for a year, and then you see how it goes. And this is not only about what data does after a while, because sometimes, you know, the data that was used in the lab is different in some meaningful way from actual data, and then we don't see that coming, and it turns out that the algorithm doesn't work as well in the real life. But also it's about how human beings use algorithms. So you can have a really good algorithm that is, say, good at predicting whether somebody will commit a crime, but it turns out that the judge doesn't use it well. Instead of just like using it as something that informs their decision, they actually always go with the algorithm. And this is something that we can't predict, because human beings are complex beings, and we react in weird ways sometimes. So we have to see like how the algorithm works in real life. And for that, I think there's no other way than a randomized control trial.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Ephraim Barrera.
Yeah, it's Ephraim, but that works too.
Ephraim.
Thank you.
Okay.
Carissa, thank you very much for your presentation. And I just wanted to ask you, could you speak more on the idea that privacy is collective rather than individual? That to expose myself, you said, is to expose others. I think this is a very valuable idea for approaching privacy. Particularly, what does it mean to understand privacy as potentially a common good, rather than an individual good that one has the right to sell or to give up, which is how it's often conceptualized? Thank you.
So there are at least two ways in which privacy is collective. On the one hand, all your personal data contains data about others. Probably these new DNA kits that are being sold for £100 or $100. And you send in your DNA sample, and it turns out that 99.9% of your DNA is collective. So only 0.01% of your DNA is actually just yours. And you're not only exposing your siblings and your parents and your kids, but also very distant kin who can have bad consequences from it, and you might never know about it. Already people in Canada have been deported on the basis of these kind of tests, trying to figure out where they actually come from. And you might never know about that. And there have been people who have been jailed because of these kind of tests. So in a way, you're kind of giving up your data, but your future children haven't consented, and you don't know whether that's going to affect their life insurance, or whether we're going to have some crazy regime like the Nazi regime, and they're going to track them down for having the wrong gene. And you can't control that. But also in more like pedestrian ways. Every time you expose, say you take you're in a concert and you take a picture and you upload it, you don't know who's behind you and whether they can be identified and whether maybe they should be there or somebody's looking for them. Every time you expose your location data, you expose your neighbors, the people who work with you. Every time you expose things about your psychology, you expose people who are like you. So you and I might both have a really similar psychological profile, and we don't know about it. And if you tell these companies a lot about you so that they can make a really precise profile of people like us, then suddenly I become exposed, and we've never met, and you don't know about that. And I certainly didn't consent to that. So that's one way in which privacy is collective. The second way in which privacy is collective is that we suffer the consequences of losses of privacy collectively. So in the case of Cambridge Analytica, only 270,000 people consented to their data being collected and answered a survey. From that, Cambridge Analytica could get access to 87 million people who are the friends of these people. And from that, Cambridge Analytica managed to make a profile on the voters of many, many countries who never knew or consented to the data collection. So in a way, privacy is a lot like ecology problems, in that it's collective. So you imagine like you're really good at recycling, you're super conscious, you shower in like 30 seconds, you do everything right. But if the rest of your country doesn't care, then you're doomed. You're going to suffer the consequences of global warming just as your neighbor. And in another way, privacy is similar to ecology in the sense that these harms are very cumulative. So no little pollution is going to create global warming, not one car, not one puff of a cigarette, but the accumulation of it through years is going to cause it. And once we realize it, it's too late. It's already happened. So, no data point is going to be the end of you. It's the accumulation of them and how companies aggregate them and how they use them. And by the time you get your identity stolen, it's too late. You can't recall that data anymore. It's lost. And so it's something that we really have to take into account regarding our psychology to get in front of this problem as opposed to behind.
Okay, thank you, Frank, for your question. I now have a question from Louise Ringuette in the chat, so I'm just going to read it and perhaps then just use one of my host prerogative to slip one of my questions I think is connected to that. So she says, how can we change the increasing culture of collecting all personal data we can, just in case we would need it for innovation or other reasons? And the other question is, I think you mentioned that also and in the book, and there's so much more to be said about the economics of personalized advertisement. It rests on so many like claims and beliefs, and maybe it's a bit harder for us like philosophers to really dig into that literature. But I really wonder, like, to what extent all this personal data collection is really sound from an economic perspective. Like, it's really beneficial for these organizations. You do mention that in the book. I think at some point you say that it only increased it creates an uptick of about only just 4%. Forgive me if the number is wrong, but really not that much. But there's so much more to be said about that. And so the question from Louise was about the increasing culture of collecting all personal data. So I thought there was a connection with that.
So I'm not sure I understand Louise's question, but I'm going to try to answer that. And then if I'm wrong, please correct me, Louise. So
I may explain more if you want.
Sure, please go ahead.
It's not my first language, English, so my accent is very terrible, but I'm sorry about that.
Don't worry.
What we may see everywhere, it's the same in public health, in research. It's that culture, you know, like MERS or things like that, of collecting everything we can, and people saying, oh yeah, but maybe we will need it for that, or maybe we will need it for this. And when you try to stop that, because in the past I've worked in the privacy commissioner analysis, I was working at the Commission d'accès à l'information du Québec, and it was very difficult to stop some people in public health, for example, to collecting the total birth date or zip code, because they were doing surveillance about chronic disease or things like that. So we were trying to say why you need this data or that data, and it was very difficult to stop them, because they want everything they can, because it exists, they want it. So how we can stop that culture?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's not going to be easy. And that's the current paradigm, right? Collect everything you can and keep it for as long as possible, just in case.
Yes.
And I think there are two powerful arguments against that view. One is that is a way to get very inaccurate information, because personal data is information that typically gets outdated very quickly. And many times you are working with old data, and you know the person's address is not there anymore. For instance, how many companies are using likes from Facebook, and how many times we like something 5 years ago and we never go back to unlike, right? And we don't like Backstreet Boys anymore, like we used to like them when we were 14, but not anymore. And so one argument is like the more we delete all data, the fresher our data will be, and the more likely it will be accurate. So that's one thing. But the more important, I think, argument is that we are completely biased in favor of the benefits of personal data, and we haven't seen the negative aspect of it, this dark aspect, toxic aspect. And that's why we have to think about personal data as a toxic asset. Like, do you really want to have a ticking bomb under your company? Like, if you knew that this is going to end up in a huge fine from the GDPR or something similar, or it's going to end up in a lawsuit, or you're going to completely lose space over this, you wouldn't want to keep that data. So really, we are creating our own risk as institutions and as society. One of the arguments that I find very powerful is that of the role of forgetting. Through most of human history, we have forgotten much more than we have remembered. And forgetting has a really important role to play, not only for individuals. If we remembered everything we have ever lived through, we would be crippled, first by the trauma, but also, especially in the last year, but also just by the weight of our past. We need to forget our past to some extent to be able to face the future. And in the same way, societies that remember too much turn to be really harsh societies and unforgiving societies. And in the past, we had natural ways of forgetting. Our memories are limited. And also, for instance, when we first started to use paper, it was acid-free. So it eventually would just crumble, or there would be fires or floods. And now we have turned up the economy of remembering upside down. And now the default is to remember as much as possible. And there's an argument to be made that that's really unhealthy and dangerous for our psychology and our well-being as societies. So yeah, I think the two arguments is that data is going to be old and inaccurate, and it's a liability, it's a risk, it's going to end up coming to bite you.
Okay, Frédéric Bruno.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you very much. It was really interesting. You were talking, you just said just about what you just said, and forgetting is sometimes really close to forgiving. There's a link between forgetting and forgiving and the polarization. So that I just thought about that while you were saying it, taking it out loud. But I had a question. You were talking about earlier about trade-offs, and we often hear that one of the trade-offs for privacy, we hear a lot of people talking about that, is that we would have to pay for the services we're using for free. I know it's not for free, but we're dealing it with our data actually, and that might be, of course, if there's a privacy service and the one that is not private or whatever, I could choose the one which is private. But if I have to pay $100 a year or $150 a year, I might want myself to pay for it, but I know a lot of people that wouldn't want to pay for that and would be willing to sell their data to continue just as like we're doing for emails and everything, as everyone knows. So I wanted to hear a bit from you on that.
Yeah. First, a final thought on Louise's question. There's also an argument that by having more data, we're actually inserting more noise into the signal. So typically, at the moment we collect data, we have a particular question. And if we have too much data, many times it's a lot harder to answer that question. So if we're looking for a needle in the haystack, adding more hay to the haystack, it's not going to help. So a lot of the times having more data is actually not beneficial to having more knowledge. So that's another thing. Okay, so the question is, about paying. So, excluding extreme poverty, obviously, if you're in a situation of extreme poverty, then you're not going to be able to pay and you're not going to want to pay. But excluding extreme poverty, in a way, it might be the case that the current data economy is going to be even more expensive on you than if you pay for these services, right? If you don't get that loan that you want, if you don't get that job that you want, you have to pay more for that plane ticket. If you have to pay for the identity theft and for the consequences of that. So in a way, and probably at the end of the day, you're going to end up paying more anyway. And, in 2013, there was an article by Forbes that calculated that for Google to be as rich as it was back then, and it was already very rich, it had to earn $10 per user around the world a year. And that seems like really affordable. I would be delighted to pay $10 for my privacy to be protected. So it's not gonna necessarily be like a steep price. And it has an incredible advantage. Once you pay for whatever you get, you are the client. And the loyalties of that company are with you. At the moment, the loyalty of Google is with publishers and with other people, it's never with us. And that has really bad consequences for us. So not only we might get it cheap, but also we might get a much better product and service if we're actually the clients.
$10, and that's an interesting figure. You also mentioned that that's something I learned from the book, but you also draw a distinction between advertisement that is based on personalized data and advertisement that is contextual. So potentially it's possible for big firms like Google to earn almost as much money with contextual advertising, which raises other issues. But then that would mean that they could still provide the same services while infringing considerably less on people's personal data. No?
Yeah, that's true, Dominic. You asked about the economics of ads, and that's really interesting. We kind of tend to imagine that, these big companies know what they're doing, and this is very scientific, and surely if they pay for personalized ads, that's because they work. But it's actually not that clear. So there's a really interesting article that was written about eBay and how eBay had spent like millions of dollars in personalized ads, and then when they actually studied it, when they hired a scientist to study this, it turned out that it wasn't working at all, that people were clicking on the ads that would have clicked on the organic search anyway. So one of the things that I argue is that even though personalized ads do seem to be more effective, they're not effective enough. So they're about 4% more effective, but they cost about 98% more than a non-personalized ad. So the cost may outweigh whatever benefit we have. And furthermore, at the moment, really, companies advertise Facebook not only because the personalized ads is there and because it's targeted, but also because everyone's there. And so that's more of a network effect than the effect of personalized ads.
Okay, I think now at this point we are Sébastien asked to ask a question. So Sébastien, please go ahead.
Yeah. So Carissa, I had it was a bit part of my question earlier, but I'm wondering for the auditing of the algorithm. I wonder in practice, do you think we should have a new body, like instead of data protection authorities, that set the standard of what algorithms should collect and discrimination, or do you think it should be the data protection authority, or what do you imagine? So as you said, the regulation is not enough and we have to do more, but I'm just imagining, so imagine that Canada wants to be ahead on terms of this, and should it be the Data Protection Authority duty to gain the expertise to audit algorithms? Should it be another entity? Should this entity set the standard? I mean, what do you think should be the best?
That's a good question. So this is tentative because I'm not sure, but I think an agency is probably a very good idea. And if we think about it, every time we've had to regulate like a really big company or a really big industry, like say airplanes and cars and things like that, we have a particular agency to deal with that. And it seems like data protection agencies are first underfunded, understaffed, and that also algorithms deal with things that include privacy, but that go above and beyond privacy. So I think it probably would be a good idea to have an agency for big tech to regulate big tech, and whether data protection agencies are going to be completely independent or somehow part of this agency would be a further question, and I haven't thought it through enough. But I think it would probably make sense to have an agency dedicated to these companies, and partly because they have so much power. Then if we just give them like a data protection agency that is really small and really underfunded, we're really not going to get anywhere.
Thank you.
So the next in the chat, I have a question from Rémi Dion. I don't know if it was a question that he intended, that he wanted that we ask you officially, but I'm going to ask it nonetheless because I think it's interesting. And but of course, feel free to protect your personal privacy as much as you want in answering that question. So the question goes as follows. Would you like to share how your research has impacted the way you live your digital life? So what do you do personally now, given what you've told us?
So first of all, like, I'm not the best example. And there are many reasons for that. Not only am I very human, but also I have chosen a profession in which I have to expose myself to get that message out, right? I want my book to do well. I want as many people to read it because I want to change these things. And for that, I'm standing here, I'm inviting you into my home, and that makes me really, really anxious. So, you know, if you have a different profession or different objectives, you don't necessarily have to have that kind of life. You know, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but some of the best doctors I've ever met are really unhealthy people. That's not because they don't know what they should do, but because they're so dedicated to their jobs that they are kind of not the best example. So don't take me as the standard. However, I do all kinds of things. Like, I have some things that are just in hard drives and not in my computer. I have a lot of things in paper. I drive my family and my friends absolutely crazy with things. And, you know, I cover my camera and my mic. I use Signal. I use VPN. So yeah, all kinds of things. Nonetheless, I'm far, far from perfect. And partly because I've chosen to expose myself more than I would like to, so to get this message out. Okay.
Do you use any specialized browsers or browser extensions? Perhaps I know that those are getting increasingly popular.
Yeah, so one thing that I recommend is have many browsers and don't use them in the same way. So for instance, the browser that you use to kind of search online, I only use it for that. And then use another browser for signing in to things, so such that you cannot be connected to like who you are and what you look for. Also, yeah, so Brave is a browser designed for privacy, although it uses some kind of Chrome technology, and so some people criticize it for that. Firefox is good if you use extensions. So a couple of good extensions are Privacy Badger, that has been designed by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and HTTPS Everywhere, which encrypts most web pages that are not encrypted. Yeah, those are good.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for the tips. I use Brave personally. So it protects your privacy, and it makes your search, your browsing even faster, actually, because you don't have to wait for the time for all the advertisement to load up.
Exactly.
Okay. So the next question, and I think our last question at this point. So our next and last question is from Aude Marie Marcoux. So go ahead, Aude.
Yeah, hi Carissa, thanks a lot for your talk, and I'm really looking forward for reading your books. You talk about the need for regulations, the big role that individuals has to play, and the need for organizational accountability. But I'd like to hear you, your perspective about data scientists themselves. During my research, I noticed an important issue in some organizations, which is that the management misunderstanding of AI model, of AI possibilities, of AI ethical issues. And this has a big impact on the requests that are made to the data scientist team and on the decisions that are made. So I'd like to hear your perspective on the role of data scientists themselves, on their data scientists' ethical awareness.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. So again, I think here we can learn a lot about from medicine. So in the 1950s, doctors didn't have to study ethics at all. And once bioethics took off, then at least they have to have one bioethics course. They have to have some idea of what are the ethical issues and some idea of to be able to identify these. So now I'm teaching some data scientists, and the bad thing about, the unfortunate thing with data scientists is that they don't have the ethics committees that now doctors can count upon to consult on difficult cases. But basically what I say to them is that they have a lot of power because they make the magic work. Like without them, there's no algorithm. And that makes them have a lot of power of negotiation as well. Also because everybody's looking for the best data scientists and they're short of them. So they do have a lot of power to say, no, I'm just not going to participate in this. And most of them will find a very good job elsewhere if they are pushed into doing something unethical. And one of the things that I teach them are examples of scientists who have regretted their inventions. And basically I say, like, do you want to be this person who worked so hard to build something and then just wish they hadn't? And there are many examples, but of course, one of them is, and some are not so obvious, but one of them is Kalashnikov, who built this rifle and, well, whatever it's called. And then there's a really interesting letter that he writes to his priest asking, like, do you think I'm responsible for all the deaths that have been caused with this tool that I thought was only going to be used for this just war? And in fact, it's being used all over the world for very questionable causes. And one of the things that I emphasize is that once you build something, you can bet that you will lose control over it. Once it's built and it's successful, they're going to take it away. They're going to sell it. They're going to buy it. They're going to steal it. And so there's a lot of responsibility to build things from the start that cannot be abused. And that's a really high standard. And in some cases, it might be impossible. But it's something to really take into account and keep in mind, like, you have to think like a villain. Like, if I were like the psychopath, how could I misuse this and hurt people? Because that's the world we live in. So at the moment, data scientists have a lot of responsibility on them. They shouldn't have as much responsibility. We should like build structures for them to have more support. Like we build the structures for doctors to have more support. But at the moment, that's what we have. So we have to make them as aware as possible of their power.
Okay, thank you. That was an interesting question. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Carissa, again. I'm not seeing any more questions in the list. So I think if that is the case, I think we could end the meeting here. We're just slightly earlier than usual. So again, thank you, everyone. This was a very interesting discussion, and not the least of which because the topic is so important. Thank you also, Sébastien and Mario, for your comments. And yeah, I think we all deserve a virtual clap. And for the people that would be interested to buy your book, it's only available in pre-order in Canada right now, but I think it should be available as of the end of January.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This has been a pleasure. And if you read the book, I hope you like it and tell me what you think.
Perfect.